I'm Katherine Gibson for Insight. Today I'm joined by Robin Wright, author of a new book, Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World. Robin, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's nice to be with you.
You originally wanted to write a book about the Islamic world since 9/11. How did that idea grow and change during the course of your research? And what was it like to watch the events of the Arab Spring unfold as you're nearing completion of that book?
Well, I started the book because I wanted to have something that would chronicle the changes in the Islamic world in the decade since 9/11. I actually went in with the idea of the extraordinary forces that were developing on the ground, both politically and culturally, and how it was so different. And many of the people I went to see in Egypt, for example, then went on weeks later to start the Arab uprising. And I had friends who were tweeting me or sending text from Tahrir Square saying, we've got 10,000 today, or we're going to camp out tonight. So I had it all unfolding real time because of the people I talked to for this book.
Talk a little bit about how you feel about that term, Arab Spring.
I actually think Arab Spring does a disservice to both the movements and the protesters, because this is a phenomena that happened between December and March, just in terms of the time. But we also had an Arab Spring in 2005 and 2006. We had the Damascus Spring. That this is not the first time the Arabs have tried to challenge regimes to bring about change, but it isn't the explosion. Nothing is going to happen seasonally, and the whole idea of a long hot summer and a cold winter is catchy, but it really doesn't reflect the historic scope of the most important wave of empowerment in the early 21st century.
You see three different movements taking place in the Islamic world today: the Arab revolts, the counter-jihad, and the revolt against Islamic ideology. I'm wondering, how do these three movements overlap, and how do you see them interacting in the next few years?
Well, the Arab revolts are protests against the autocrats who have ruled in so many of these countries, in some cases for decades. The counter-jihad is the stand against extremism, against violence, against Al-Qaeda and other movements, the realization that they don't produce tangible solutions to the problems of everyday life, whether it's education, housing, employment, even garbage collection. And the third is the challenge to Islamic ideologies, particularly Iran's theocracy. And it's a rejection, as we saw in the 2009 protests after the presidential election, where millions took to the streets across the country to say no to a dictatorship, no to injustice. And so it plays out on lots of different levels. It's part of a single historic phenomena that's trying to bring about change.
You wrote that counter-jihad will define this next decade in much the same way as extremism defined the early 2000s. What evidence do you see for such a movement?
One of the things that's so interesting to me is the culture of change, which reinforces the politics of change and reflects the depth of what's happening. And it's reflected in the rappers and hip-hop Islam who are giving voice. Rap has become the rhythm of resistance in many of these countries. It's reflected in the new Muslim comedians who are telling jokes against extremists, in the playwrights who are using the word jihad in their titles, but it's a very different type of jihad. One of the plays is called Till Jihad Do Us Part, and it's a romantic comedy. And it's all about seizing the idea of jihad away from the militants and taking back to its original meaning.
What are some of the most surprising elements of counter-jihad that you found during the course of your research? What surprised you the most?
One of the most interesting ideas to emerge is the idea of a new kind of martyrdom. We're so used to the idea of martyrs over the last 30 years who were suicide bombers trying to kill, whether it was leaders or foreign troops or innocent civilians. And one of the things that's so striking about the uprisings today are the new martyrs, like the young fruit vendor in Tunisia, who started this whole trend because he wanted to challenge the regime over a bribe, a $7 bribe that he didn't want to pay. And when he was hassled by the inspector, his produce taken away, his electronic scale, which was his main equipment, he challenged the system, couldn't find anyone to listen to him, and covered himself with paint thinner. and set himself on fire and died several weeks later. And this was a man who wasn't trying to kill anyone else. He was trying to shame his government. And this has happened over and over and over. A 13-year-old in Syria, a young blogger in Egypt. You find the pattern throughout. And they're not hurting anyone else. They're shaming their governments far more effectively and changing politics more effectively than any of the militant groups. So this is, in many ways, the most tangible evidence of a counter-jihad.
There's been a lot of talk about the role political Islam will play in Tunisia and Egypt. How do you see that playing out in the next year or two?
The next decade is likely to be both more democratic in the demands for political participation, free and fair elections, right to free speech and assembly, and independent media, but it's also likely to be more Islamic, at least the physical appearance and the number of Muslim political groups that emerge. But what's so interesting about the Muslim political spectrum is its enormous scope. Put aside the liberal groups, the secular groups, of which there are many. There are many now within the Islamic spectrum. Take Egypt, for example. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, which is fragmenting in many ways along generational lines. The younger generation saying to the older, your leadership was not elected democratically within our movement, and therefore you may not reflect the whole movement. The principles of not allowing women or Coptic Christians who are a minority to run for the presidency, again, has alienated many of the young. So people are breaking away. So there are many of these groups who have renounced violence. There are others who have renounced violence, like the Salafis in Egypt, but they want a pure Islamic system with rigid application of Sharia law, in which Saudi Arabia is more of a model. And those are the ones I worry about because they're not as flexible about inclusion of everyone. Whereas many of the other Islamic political parties have at least given, written commitments, said repeatedly that they are prepared to accept the principles of democracy and renounce violence. And that's important, and they will be held to account if they don't.
One of the most interesting chapters in the book examines the Obama administration's response to these revolts. Do you see signs of a consistent policy now as we move farther and farther away from the revolts themselves?
Well, in February there was an 11-day period when the administration moved quite dramatically from support for leaders like President Mubarak in Egypt and President Ben Ali in Tunisia, and basically walked away from them. Didn't try to ensure that they could survive until the next election or some natural transition. So that was one of the most historic changes in U.S. policy in the Middle East in 60 years. But since then, the administration has been quite inconsistent in the way it talks about democracy. We're allowing it, encouraging it across North Africa, into the Levant, as far as Syria. But when it comes to the Gulf, we are much more conservative. We have the same instincts that we had in the past, giving priority to economic security, our access to oil. The Gulf is also a kind of buffer zone against fears of Iran and its intentions, whether it's the nuclear program or the spread of its ideology. And so we have basically stood on the side of the monarchies, many of whom are the most autocratic regimes in the world. And so this is a real challenge, and people in the region are skeptical about what our long-term intentions are. Are we really for democracy everywhere?
What's next for you?
I think one of the things we need to understand are the lessons of the Arab revolts. And so next year I want to take a look back, trying to bring together people from throughout the region to help coordinate what are the lessons on politics, on social media, on youth and demographics, on the economy in each of these places, so we understand the patterns of change. And because it's in the Middle East, we're often going to have a great deal of nervousness about the implications for our own future, for some of our allies, including Israel, for the so-called clash of civilizations. What does it mean, particularly given the events in Norway where a right-wing extremist was fearful of Muslims and their presence in Europe. These are all issues that are going to play out for the next generation, and so it's important to begin figuring out some of the basic lessons from all of this.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today, Robin. I appreciate it.
Thank you.